Hello and welcome to BlenderTutor.com. My name is Tom Latvies, and in this series we're going to go over creating a frosted glass material. You could use it to create motion graphics like I did, titles, a poster, or a still image. There's a variety of different ways you could use this material, but in this video this is just going to be a brief overview of what we're going to be learning in the series. So I have a few examples of some frosted glass, and basically what it looks like, or what the effect we're looking for really is kind of this bumped glass surface that displaces whatever the image is behind the glass to give us a cool look. This is just an interesting shape. There's a whole bunch of different, in our case, I created kind of an icy look, but we could really use any texture we want to create the bump of the glass that we're looking for. And another way to think about it is it really reminds me of this poster for The Dark Knight, how kind of the closer the object is to the glass, the more in focus it is, or the sharper it is, and the farther away it is from the glass, the more out of focus it gets. So that's kind of the effect we're looking for. And in my animation, so in the animation you can see as it gets closer to the glass, it gets sharper and more in focus. It has this cool effect as it gets closer. And as you can see, I've also added some nice smoke effect coming down, make it look nice and icy. And we'll go over all of that later in the tutorial. So just to take a look at the blend file real quick, it's actually very simple in what's in it. We just have our main ice wall right here. We have our text element that gets closer as time goes on. We have our little Blender logo that also does the same thing. And then really everything else is just lights. And then we just have a camera and one other light, and that's it. It's a pretty simple thing. It's just creating the right materials and getting the right light set up. So that is pretty much the overview. All right, so let's get started. So the basic scene is actually really simple to set up. Let me just get my screencast keys going real quick. All right, so let's go to front view, and I'm just gonna scale up my starting cube up. So just hit S, Shift Y, because you want to bring it up on everything except for the Y-axis. Go to the side view, and I've been scaling this down because this is basically the thickness of our ice wall, and I found that the thicker the wall is, the more out of focus everything is behind it, and I want to be able to read the text. So I don't have an exact thickness that is perfect, but just experiment around there is good, or that worked for me. So I'm going to go to my front view by hitting 1 on the number pad, and then hitting Control-Alt-0 will bring our camera to our view. And really quick, I have my camera set to 28 millimeters, but that's just my choice. Do whatever looks right for you. I'm just going to take my wall now and scale it up along the X so it just fills my camera view. I'm going to scale it up a little more. And that's a good starting point. I'm just going to delete this light. We'll add our own lights later. And I might actually even be able to scale this up a little bit on the Y. But we'll adjust it once we get to that point. Okay, so now I'm just going to add a basic material to this. Let me call this ice wall real quick. And you know what? Let's just really quick save our blend file. So I'll call it ice wall tutorial. All right. So let's add our material now. Use nodes and hit, I'm just going to call it ice. And for our main shader, it's going to just be the glass shader. Now, the only thing we really need to tweak on this is the IOR value, which stands for index of refraction, and that's basically that controls how light passes through the glass and how it warps it. So you could actually just search online for IOR chart, and it'll give you a list of all the different. I'll provide a link on the website, but basically it'll show you all the different values for different materials. And for ice, which is what I'm trying to create right now, it is 1.309. So you could just type that in and you'll be good. And that's really all we have to adjust right now until we get into textures. So before we get into texturing this right off, I'm just going to show you what we'll be using. I'm going to provide this texture for you. This is an icy crystal ice texture that I created a tileable version of it. I found this online and brought it into Photoshop and created a tileable version. And we'll really only be using the black and white bump map of this that I created. And all I did was, once I created my tileable texture, I desaturated it and messed with the curves to bring up the contrast a little. So I will provide that on the website. And let's get into texturing this. It's really simple. We only have to texture one part of this. So go into your face mode, and then just select the face that is facing the camera, and hit Control E and go to Mark Seam. And that'll put your little red line around it. And now we're going to unwrap it. So let's go over to the UV image editor. And if you go into front view over here and you hit U, you can go to project from view, and it'll give us our proper shape. I scale that up to about here, and then I'm going to open our texture. So it'll be this ice tile bump. Hit OK. And there we go. That is all we need. Now I could close that back up, and now I'm going to bring down the node editor and go into our material setup. And this is going to be a really easy setup, actually. All I need for this top part is a new texture image, and I could bring in my ice tile bump, put that on the roughness value, and then I'm going to actually duplicate that and bring in a mix RGB node, put that into the bottom part, and change the factor value to 0.3. And we're going to put that into the displacement. So now, not only is this going to be affecting the roughness of the glass to let how much light will come in through the ice, but this will actually add bump to the front of the ice block or ice wall, so that when we have some light bouncing off of it, it's going to get some interesting reflections. All right, so now that we've done that, let's actually test out how this looks. So we're going to need a light behind it to see what it looks like. So I'm going to bring in a plane, move that back along the Y, and rotate it along the X 90 degrees. And now let's go into our camera view and just scale that up a little bit. Scale it far along the X. You're going to want to go quite a bit farther than the actual ice wall, because the way that the light moves through it, it needs to be larger than the actual object so that it spans all the way across. So now let's give this a new material, and I'm just going to call this light bar, and we'll give it an emission shader. And my color, since I'm trying to create an icy look, I'm going to give it like this light blue color. And for the strength, I'm going to give it 10. And all right, so right off the bat now, we should be able to see if this is working or not. So let's render that. And it's looking good. I mean, the texture-wise, it's looking good. You could see it's starting to form our crystally, icy look. I'm going to actually really quick adjust. So the sampling for preview, I'm going to bring that up to 50 just so I get a little sharper. And yeah, that's starting to look good. Now you can see around here, I have this grayness that I don't love. I'm actually going to, let's turn that off real quick. I'm going to go into the world settings. We'll just use nodes. And I'm going to give this a blue value as well. And then I'm going to turn it down even darker. You don't need exact black because you want a little bit of light from it. But now if I go back into here, you can see it's looking a little nicer and it has a bluer tint to it. And yeah, that's pretty much where we want it to be. It might be a little wide. We could scale it down the Z a little. And then I'm going to move that up. And now just one last part is I'm going to put our text in. So let's add text. And you could type whatever you want. I'll just put icy wall. And you're going to want to rotate that along the X 90 degrees. If we go into our side view, you want to move that back until it's just barely touching the wall. So this line right here is the back of our wall. We're going to want to bring that as close as we can without touching. And then the last thing, well, I'm going to scale it up, definitely. Move it here. Let's give our camera really quick just to line this up a little. I'm going to give it the safe areas, and I'm going to also turn on thirds, and it's going to give me an easy way to adjust this so that it's aligned properly. And what I did for mine was I had the top of the text touching the top of this line right here. And the other thing I would recommend is that you change the font, because the Blender, default font is not really great for motion graphics or anything. So if you know where your fonts folder is, go find a font that you like. I recommend checking dafont.com. It has a lot of great free fonts that you can download. So I'm gonna stick with this one. This is my Blender Tutor font that I use. And then what I did was I put the light pretty much right in the center of the text. So now, well, we'll want to also give this a new material. So give the text a new material and I called it just black. And all I used for this was a holdout material because it does not get shaded at all. And then just for my use, I colored that dark so that I would be able to differentiate it. So now, I'm going to save that real quick, and then let's look at a render real quick. And there we go. We're already getting the look that we want. Cool. All right, so in this tutorial, we're just going to go over the lighting of this scene. And basically, I'm just going to explain why I've lit it that way to get the look we want. So as you can see, we already have our main light set up. And that's doing most of the work for us, especially with our text. So if we look at that, that's letting us read. It might even be a little too big still. So I'm going to just scale that down along the Z even more so it's nice and thin. So now if we look at that, because I don't want it to be too bright. All right. And you know what? The other thing I'm going to do is our text is really nice and crisp and readable, and sometimes, you know, that's what you're going to want, but I actually want it a little bit difficult to read. So I'm going to move that back away from the glass a little, just a bit. And now let's take a look at that. I just want to get some nice distortion. So now you can see already it's a little farther away and it's not perfectly crisp anymore. It's a little softer. I might even move it a little more. So let's just move that back, like maybe around there. And the other thing we could do if we wanted to be a little more difficult to read is we could actually make the ice thicker. So I'll just maybe double it. And now let's look at that and see what that looks like. Yeah, that's looking a little better. It's dispersing the light behind us a little more, and it's giving the text a little more interesting of a look. But the problem is, we can see it's kind of warping now, and I like the look it's getting, but you can't tell that the front of the glass is actually bumpy or raised or anything. So what we're going to want to do is I'm going to add a sun lamp. So go in there and add a sun and just bring that up to the front like that. And I'm going to rotate it towards the ice wall. And then I just, you know, put it at an angle like that just to get some interesting light bouncing off of it. And so my sun, for the size, I made it 0.05. And for the strength, it was just 2. It's not, you know, it doesn't need to be crazy strong, but just enough to give it some glare. And I also gave that a blue color because I really want this to look like a cold looking icy wall. So now let's take a look at that. And you know, the more of this we do, the longer the render time is going to take, and we're going to get these fireflies. But now we're getting some more interesting lighting coming off of it. And if we let it render long enough, we're going to get some good like bump over this. You can see there's now some like bump over the text. And that's what I'm looking for. All right. So that's the basic setup of that. We could adjust that a little more later. But now I'm going to get into the last part of the lighting, which if you look at my original, you know, render, you could see that I do have this like a light bar behind there, but there's also just random lights everywhere. And that was just to make it, for one, look a little more interesting and random, so it didn't look just like so flat and then just one light. But also it added some depth once I added the animation in. And how I did that was I went in and I added an icosphere, because it doesn't need to be high poly or anything. And I just moved that back. So where is so there's our light bar. So I'm going to put that like right there, and I'm going to give it a new material. Actually, I'm going to give it the light bar material. Press this 2 right here, because that means it has multiple users. But if I click on that, it's going to create its own material based off of the original material. So I'm going to call this low light. And I'm basically just going to bring the strength down to 3. But everything else I'm going to keep the same. I'm going to keep the color the same. And all I did really was I created that. And then I just started duplicating that, moving it around, scaling it to different sizes. And then also going by the side view and putting it at different depths. So they're all on different planes and at different heights and everything. And then what I did was I took those. I might make a couple more. Scale that one really tiny. And I'm going to now take all of these and duplicate those. You know, rotate them some more. Duplicate it again, and just I keep on doing this to get random variations. Yeah, maybe scale it up a little. And then rotating it like that. And I'm just really trying to get random variations of these lights spread out throughout this background. And it's just going to give some nice variation to the lighting and make it a little more interesting looking. And you're going to want it to go all the way on either end. So that way when you add some animation to this, it'll look like, you know, all the lights aren't in one spot. It's going to look nice and spread out and give it some depth. So now if we look at this rendered, we have a lot more interesting of an image here. And especially if we were to, you know, I can't really do it in render view, but if I were to animate this, either going from side to side or moving closer in, since all of these lights are on different planes and in different areas, it's going to move nicely and it's going to give it a more interesting look. And, you know, once again, you know, I'm just going for this icy wall look, but if you're going for just a frosted glass door or a creepy look, you know, that might not be the best way to do it, but just experiment. And really the backlighting is what makes this work. So find something that works for you. And I mean, really, as far as the lighting goes, that's all I did. I just experimented with a bunch of different things until I found something I liked. And that's how it ended up working out. So that's the basic extent of the lighting. This isn't as many lights as I had in my final scene, but for this, it works. Because I also had the little Blender logo down here, so I needed, you know, if you have something that you want backlighting around, what makes it work is that it's surrounded by light behind it. Because otherwise it's going to kind of blend into the dark background if you don't do something like that. So you want to make sure that you have light behind the object that you're trying to look at through the ice or through the glass. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so in this tutorial, we're going to go over creating the smoke sim to create the foggy smoke falling over our ice wall. It's actually very simple. What we're going to want to do is, let's name this scene. I'm just going to call it ice. And then we're going to create a new scene. If you hit this plus button and hit link objects, and I'll explain why we're doing that in a second. And I'm going to call this smoke. And we're going to actually change it to Blender Render because the smoke sim right now, smoke will only render inside of Blender Render. Hopefully, well, not hopefully, they have announced eventually we will be able to render smoke in cycles. But for now, we're just going to have to do it this way, and we'll just composite it in later. So we're going to get rid of all of these. And so basically, to explain why I did link data instead of create complete copy or anything else like that is when we animate our camera, it's gonna, you don't want to have to animate everything twice. So if we animate it once in one scene, it'll actually carry over that information into the other scene. So you only have to do the work once. So for this, we actually don't even really need the wall. All we need is this lamp, and we're going to take this. And what I did was I took the very top face right here, and I just duplicated it. And then if you hit P, selection, and now just move that over, and I'm going to scale it along the Y. A little more. And move it pretty much over in front of our ice wall. Now that I have that placed, I could delete our ice wall. And I'm going to just call this smoke emitter. And I can remove the material off of that. And I could even get rid of our icy wall text. So now what we're going to do is if you hit the space bar and type in quick, you have all these different options. We're going to hit quick smoke, and it's going to just give it a default material and create a domain around it. For the domain, we're just going to scale it up a little bit on either end, move it along the Y closer to this end because we don't need so much of the background or like this side, but we want this to be nice and open. And then just scale it along the Z, move it down. And once again, you're just going to want to make it sure that it falls below the screen or below the camera. So that should be good. And this gives us our default material. Just to be quick, I changed this density up to, not point, but 7 from 5. And I changed the step size for my final render from 0.1 to 0.02. Basically, the smaller this number is, the sharper the smoke will look. So now to go into the simulation settings, all I really did was I changed this up to, I believe, around 64. And I believe I added a dissolve down like up to 100 or something. I think I left the scale at 1. A few other things. I turned on the adaptive domain, and all that does is creates. Oh, our other issue right now is that it's when it's smoking, the smoke rises. We want to change that so the density is. The higher value results in faster rising smoke. So we want this, and I believe 0.01. No. Oh, I'm sorry. Not density. 0.00. We can leave that. We want the temperature to be different. So just do -0.1. And you can see now that's falling instead of rising, which is what we want. And it's giving this interesting look right now. So the next thing we're going to want to do is decide how long our animation is going to be. I made mine 8 seconds at 24 frames a second, but the longer you make it, the longer the smoke sim has to go on and the more data it's going to create. So you just need to decide how long you want to wait, because it also takes a long time for your computer to calculate all of that data. So let's say I wanted to do 8 seconds. That's 24 times 8. So that's 192. So, you know, for this instance, let's do 5 seconds. So 24 times 5 is 120. So you could change your in point to 1, out point to 120. And you know what? I actually did have this set to 128. I had a nice and fine detailed smoke. I wanted it to be, you know, have some nice detail in it. The next thing I did was I also turned on high smoke or smoke high resolution. which is going to also increase your calculation time. I raised that up to 2 divisions, and I changed this to FFT. And the last thing we're going to really deal with for this is the smoke cache. This is another place where I just change this to 120. And you could also decide where it saves it. So I'm going to save this to my desktop. You know, save it anywhere that makes sense for you, maybe your documents folder. So I'm going to go to my desktop, create a folder that's called Ice Wall Smoke Sim Tutorial. And that is where I'm going to save all of this data. And now what we're going to do is just bake that really quick. So you're going to, oh, and I actually did one more thing just to make it a little more interesting, is I added a force field and I added some turbulence. And for turbulence, I just turned it up to like 3. Flow was 1. And what you could do is animate that. So on the first frame, put a location or a rotation keyframe. If you hit I, you can add a keyframe. And now go to our last last frame, which is 120, and just if I hit RR, it lets me free rotate this. And now I put I rotation again, and that now rotates. And that's going to basically affect our smoke. So now that was the last thing I did. I can select our domain right here and hit bake all dynamics. And this is going to give me this little number right here that's basically the percent that it is calculated. And now we wait. So I'll come back once this is all calculated. All right, so our calculations are done. Let's take a look at our sim. So now if I I can't really scroll through it in real time, but if I just kind of go forward, you can see I have some nice looking detail now. And what I could do is, for one, I want to make sure my sun lamp is still working. I still want to have that kind of blue lighting, so I'm going to change that, and I'm going to put that up to like a 3, I believe. And I'm going to put on a ray shadow. And let's give it a real quick test render. See how it looks. So, all right, we have some nice blue smoke. Cool. And it doesn't, it doesn't look amazing right now, but it's okay because it's going to be pretty see-through. And it's just to add a little extra detail over our image anyway. So it doesn't need to be like the most amazing looking smoke. This is going to work for our cause. The last thing we're going to want to do, though, is we want it to have an alpha channel so that we could actually composite it over our image. So I'm going to change this in the output from RGB to RGBA. That A is for alpha. And then I believe, let me see. In shading, we're going to change alpha to transparent. So now if I was to render this again, give it some time. You can see down here at the bottom of the image, now it's over this checkerboard pattern. All that basically means is it is now over alpha, so we have that alpha information that we want. So cool. Let's go back to our ice, and we're just going to now animate our camera really quick. So if you see that in our smoke scene, we changed it to 120, but here it still goes up to 250, so we just want to type in 120 there as well. And now on our first frame, put a location keyframe on our camera. And then on our last frame, let's look at this, and I'm just gonna move it forward a little bit, maybe like to about there. And I'm going to put I location. And now I have a nice moving camera. And the last thing I might do is if we go up here and go to animation, it's only really moving along the Y. So let's expand this a little bit. I just want to adjust these keyframes really quick. So I basically want it, as you can see, it's got this little like bell curve right here. I wanted to start immediately. If you look closely, as the animation starts off, it's not really moving at the beginning, and it very slowly starts moving. Then it moves at a constant rate. Then it slows down again. There are two ways we could do this. We could actually just change the keyframe style. If you select them and hit T, you can change them to linear, which you can see it changes that to a straight line. So now this is just always moving at the exact same speed now, which could be what we want. I'm going to actually change those back, and I'm just going to adjust it so this is, and all I'm doing is clicking on the right mouse button to drag this, and I'm going to basically just straighten that out because I still do want this to curve a little so it slows down near the end, but I want to start right off the bat. Cool. And that slows down a little near the end of that. All right, so we can go back to default now. And now if we go to our smoke scene, you can see that our camera is now animating the exact same amount that we just animated in our ice scene. So that's nice and easy. In this tutorial, we're going to basically go over the compositing and rendering of our ice wall and smoke, how to combine those two elements together, and then render out a nice animation. So first, one more thing before we start rendering is let's animate our text really quick. So I'm going to say maybe 2 seconds before the end of this, so 120 times 48. Or we could just go, you know, 3 seconds into the animation, so 3 times 24, so 72. So on frame 72, we want our text to be where it is now. So on frame 72, I'm going to put an in mark for location on my text. And then before that, all the way up there, I'm going to start it way back, maybe a little bit behind our light bar. And hit I location for that. And now our text is also moving in. One more time, I might clean up the animation a little. So for the text, let's find its animation. Here we go. So the x-axis is not really doing anything for us, so I could delete those keyframes. Same with the z. We could delete those. We only want our y movement. So once again, I'm going to pretty much do a similar thing to what I did, is straighten out that beginning keyframe so it just starts right off the bat, and then I want to kind of slow ease in to that movement. So now we have a nice little smooth ending to it. Cool. So we'll go back to default. And now we have all of our animation set. I'm going to save this project. And let's get to rendering. So I rendered out my animation at 720, so it'll be 1280 by 720. and we'll put that to 100%. And then we'll also have to set that in the smoke. So once again, 1280 by 720, 100%. Cool. So now let's render on a frame that actually has some smoke and some without smoke. So like halfway down. So we'll do frame 63. We can set that there, and actually let's see how that looks really quick, because that'll look kind of interesting. The text isn't right up against the glass yet, so cool. I think this will be a cool looking image. So let's go into compositing and hit use nodes and backdrop. And so we'll have ice, our main render layer, and then we're going to duplicate that down, change the scene to smoke, and we're then going to need a mix node. And we're going to put this up top, this on the bottom. If you click that, it'll turn alpha on, then we put that right there. And then we also need an output node, we need the viewer. And now let's render our... Oh, you know what? One more thing is I need to adjust the sampling on our cycles render. So for that, for my image, I did, I believe, 600 samples. And even then it had some fireflies in the animation. So for this, what I would recommend is around 600 to 700, especially if we're doing a still image that you don't need it to animate. Do 1,000. I mean, it'll add to the render time, but it'll look okay. It'll look better anyway. If you're doing an animation, I think 600 to 650 will get you by just fine. For this one, just to keep it quick, I'll keep it around 200. And then also under performance, change this up to 256 by 256. That's the recommended tile size for rendering if you're using a GPU rendering. If you're using your CPU, which by default it does, and you don't have an NVIDIA card or anything, it's recommended to use 16 by 16 for your tile size. That'll just be the optimal speed. So we've got this going, but it, for one, looks like garbage, and for two, you can see we're gonna have to re-render our smoke layer because it's using our last rendered one, which is on the wrong frame, and it's the wrong size as well. So if we re-render that now, I believe it's rendering in the background. It's not actually showing its process, but if you look right here, you can see it's rendering. And give it a second. There we go. So now we have our smoke, coming over that, but it looks horrible. We actually want to change this to add. And now you can see it's got this cool smoke effect coming over it without looking horrible. It's actually using the alpha channel. If we were to turn that off, it actually changes it a little bit what it looks like, but I would recommend keeping that on. You could also use the alpha, put that right there, and it'll work the same way. Now, that's the basic way of adding these two layers together, the smoke and the and I've been having this bug where it's not actually showing up back here. So anyway, I'm going to just do a little more tweaking to this image. Since we're at it, I'm going to actually add a color balance. Oh, there we go. For some reason, yeah, that's what happened last time. So let's adjust the color of the smoke a little more. but then the bottom image. And I want it to be a little bluer. And then I could raise that, and I could darken the shadows, adds a little contrast to it, and you could actually see the smoke a little better. The mid will actually adjust the overall brightness of our smoke, or the visibility of our smoke. And then once I do that, just to give it a little more of a nice look, I went to distort, lens distortion, and I just did that like a 0.1, maybe even less. I think it was like 0.05, just to give it a very slight lens distortion to give it an interesting look. And then in color, I brought in a RGB curves. And I just tweaked that to add a little more contrast to our final image. Maybe darken it a little. And from there, I added a little vignette, which is very simple to do. If we just duplicate that lens distortion, I think we're going to want to bring that up to a 1 and turn off fit. We also need a math node. So in, I believe, converter math, we want a less than. Change that to 0. And then we'll need, the last thing we'll need is a blur. So filter, blur, and Gaussian's fine. We could do fast Gaussian. And bring that right there. Let's look in that. And then it needs some kind of input into the lens distortion to work. So you just grab any image. Change that to 1. Let's see. There we go. So 0 in the value and the less than. Bring that into the bottom. Now we're just going to want to blur this. I think just like a 120. 120 worked out for me. And now we'll just need one more. We'll bring a mix node in. If you take these 3 and hit Control G, it'll create basically a group. Now you hit tab and it brings you back out. It creates a little node group for you, and you could actually edit that separately. But now that shrinks it down so it's not so wild looking. And now we're just going to bring in our top up there, bring in that on the bottom, change that to multiply, and then bring that right there. And it's a little dark, so I'd change this to like a 0.7 or something that looks proper for you. And that's about it. That is the general rendering technique that I used for this. And all I did was when I rendered it out, I did a PNG sequence. So in your output area right here, you could just, create a folder and I'll call it ice wall animation. And then you could actually make the actual files, give them a name as well. So I'll call this ice wall animation. I'll call that the same thing, except. And the last thing I did was just click render animation, and that busted that out for me. It is, recommended when compositing that you render out separate layers to their own file and add them at the end. And that is a better way in case something messes up or if you want to change something. But for my instance, I knew I just wanted to keep it as is. So I just saved them all out into single images. So I'll render this out really quick and show you the result. So 1 second. All right, and I guess by really quick I meant 2.5 hours. Um, so here is the animation. And obviously it's very noisy, but I was using a very low sample rate. So to give you an idea of how long it would take to render, a high quality animation, um, this took about between 2 and 2.5 hours at 200 samples. I think my final animation was rendered around 600 samples, and I just left that going overnight, and it seemed to finish. So I guess if you want to do a really nice looking one, a really nice animation anyway, you'll have to let that go overnight, or at a time when you don't need your computer. Otherwise, if you only want to do a maybe like a really large image, you could crank up the samples to maybe about between 600 and 800, and it'll still take way less than a full animation would ever take. But there you go. That is the end of the tutorial. So I hope you learned something, and I will see you guys next time.